Hello and welcome to Liam's Lyceum. Now I have a third video I'm filming in front of my tree. It's probably the last one. I have no clue when these will come out. But this one is me listing some short stories I really enjoyed. And if you like short stories like me, then let me throw a few at you. I will say all of these are fantasy stories, out of vein, at least of fantasy. And I'm going to tell you where you can find them and where you can read them. Right, so there are 12. That's just a random number I was able to come up with. There are more stories I could mention. These are ones that really stood out. I'll probably make another list in the future as I continue to read more short stories. I would like to start off to say that I was not very much not a big short story reader, even just a couple years ago. I have a hard time getting into them because they just end so quickly. So even though they can be really good, it's like reading the first couple chapters of a book over and over again, essentially, right? If you're going to keep on reading short stories. And even when it comes to characters that you love, you know, like Conan or Fafhrd and the Grey Mousers or El-Jawari, there's a characters that continue their story through multiple short stories, but you're getting the arc and the very short arcs. And so it's just not holding my attention. And it also, I can't get into them very quickly sometimes, which I think is why Sword and Sorcery is so good at this, because they just drop you right in, and they often will pull you in better than other short stories, but I digress. But I would like to say the first anthology that I ever read was Bloody Knuckles and Other Tales, I believe this was called, by T.W. Anderson. I would like to consider Tim, or Renfail as he's known online, kind of as an acquaintance, maybe slightly a friend after all these years of reading his chapters for his book. The first time 7 years ago, and so it was that writing that got me to read his anthology that came out before his novel was officially published, and that was Bloody Knuckles. And I would actually like to mention, the reason I mention it is not because it also got me into reading short stories so much as an adult, but it also has one short story that I would like to recommend to you, and that would be the JARKATH Blade, and of course by T.W. Anderson. And this is a psycholeucemia story which was supposed to be a video game. You can still read the book. And in this Bloody Knuckles anthology, there's actually two for the psycholeucemia. I did a review as one of my first reviews for the novel. But this story takes place about 500 years before the novel, when magic is still very much active and used in the world of leukemia. And this is about a deserter from the leukemia army who's just sick of war, but he finds that desertion catches up with him. He has to defend his lover and to defend himself, really, from just freedom, from escaping from his past. So now that is a great short story to start this list, but I kind of just wanted to go from top down now in my list. Now the first story that came to mind is by far my favorite short story I have ever read. Now the rest, they're not really in any order. I just want to clarify that this one is definitely my favorite one, and that would be Black Arrow by Bruce R. Cordell, who is a D&D designer. He wrote a few other books, D&D books, like novels, but this story is found in Realms of War, which is an anthology accompanying the Twilight War trilogy, which was one of my favorite reads of the year. And this story just takes you on a ride of awesomeness. The main character is a kid, kind of. He's probably like 16, 17, maybe younger than that. I'm not exactly sure, I can't remember. But he's a kid, essentially. And while the anthology the point of the anthology is conflicts of wars throughout the Forgotten Realms, throughout time. So this is a conflict that took place several hundred years ago in Impeltor, the country of Impeltor, in Sarshal specifically, the walled city of Sarshal. And this kid is noble, he's naive, and by noble I mean noble born, he's naive, and he gets thrown in with to protect the city from a horde of goblins, if I'm remembering correctly. And it starts off the story telling you that he dies. And knowing that while you're reading this story, there's like a little letter written from this like lord guy who's in charge of the defense to this guy's mother, I believe, this character's mother, and we get from that letter that he had died during this conflict. And watching it all play out, it just gives me the chills thinking about it. I was crying at this story. I was like, I've never felt these emotions from a short story ever. And even since, and it was only this year, it was about the summer of this year. But that story is amazing. I just have to recommend Black Arrow in Realms of War Anthology. Absolutely phenomenal story. You have to read that one. Anyways, let us get into the rest of the list, the next 10, since I mentioned the first 2 already. So then we have Black Colossus by Robert E. Howard. You could probably put just about any of Robert E. Howard's Conan stories on here. That's all I've read by him. I'm sure his other short stories for other things are great too. But Black Colossus was my first Conan story when I was reading through The Coming of Conan the Cimmerian. I was like, oh my goodness, this story is awesome. And it's mostly because you're not getting the story for almost all of it through Conan's perspective. You're getting it through other people's perspectives, and specifically a princess, if I'm remembering correctly, for the most part. And you just get to see like this towering figure that is Conan just own, you know what I mean? Like, he's just such an awesome character. And I felt like this was the first story that really showcased to me how great of a character this he really is, and not just to the reader, but just like that you're not alone. You know what I mean? That like you are getting similar vibes, basically, in a sense, to what this person is who's talking about Conan, because again, it doesn't follow Conan for most of the story, at least directly. So, and that was definitely my favorite story. It is my favorite Conan story I've read so far, Black Colossus. And then I want to go with ULAN Door by Jack Vance. This was the before last story in The Dying Earth, which is a novel, but it's a fix-up novel, which is just, it's made up of a bunch of short stories. And ULAN Door is the one where it's about someone going to an ancient city. The Dying Earth is kind of synonymous with The Dying Earth. It's super far in the future. So this ancient city he goes to is like a modern city. Like at one point he gets in like a helicopter, I'm pretty sure. And at another point he's like confused by this invisible wall, but I'm pretty sure it's just sliding glass doors. And it's just like, it's a super great story with like these two competing people that for some magical reason they can't tell they exist if they're wearing this, like, I believe it's the people in gray and the people in green, if I remember correctly. The people in green don't know that the grays exist, and that the greens are awesome and conquer everything. And it's the same, it's vice versa. It's the same thing for the grays, but just with the greens instead. And I just remember thinking the story was awesome, it was fun to explore, and it made me really, really dig Jack Vance. And then we have Memories by Lisa Smedman. This was found in a Dragon magazine. I'll probably find the issue and put that picture here, because I can't remember what issue it is off the top of my head. This is a Forgotten Realms story, specifically about Laringen, or whatever her name is, the Uskevran maid, from the Symbia series. Now there is a book called Heirs of Power that she is the main character in, and this is a story, if I'm remembering correctly, that takes place before that. And it's kind of about like a crush she has and like wanting to take someone to this celebration at the temple of Sune Firehair, who is the goddess of beauty and love. And it's a really kind of trippy story. It deals with memories and memory loss. It's kind of like a Groundhog Day type of thing, and it's really well done. It's showcased Smedman's writing as well. She's a really good author, and if you just want a taste of D&D in a short story format, sort of like Black Arrow, this is another one you could read. And then along the same lines, we have Another Name for Dawn by Paulus Kemp. This is the origin story for Erebus Kale. Now, his first appearance was in The Butler short story from the Halls of Stormweather, which was a precursor to his novel Shadow's Witness in the Symbia series, before he got his 2 trilogies series following that. But Erebus Kale is such a good character, and there's a couple short stories about him, and one that shows his origin as running away from his gang life in the city of Westgate and going to Symbia, into the city of Selgon specifically, where he becomes his famous bald. I mean, he's a guy that he's a linguist. He is like a gang member, like I said. He had nice red locks, and now he's totally a bald guy, like the entire series that you read about him. And so the story, I mean, I knew going in, but the story is about him, but he's going by his real name. And at the very end, when he's escaping, he's like, what's your name? He's like, my name's Erebus Kale. Now, Erebus Kale is just a signified of his name as being hunted, and for something he did. The Kale part is pertinent to the story. And another name for Dawn is just a reference to some of the linguistic parts for the constructed languages, obviously, because these are fake languages in the story. So if you like origin stories, like deep, you know, beginning origin stories, and especially if you're a fan of Erebus Kale and you haven't read it, pretty sure this one you can actually read online, though it is in Dragon Magazine originally. If I can find it online, I will link that in the description. And then another, and I think my last on this list for D&D short stories would be Dark Times and HASTARL by Ed Greenwood. Now, I felt like I couldn't leave Ed out of this. He's kind of a hit or miss author, to be honest, but at the same time, this is a story that you probably wouldn't get a ton from if you have not read Elminster Making of a Mage, which is the origin story for Elminster. And if you have read that story, you would know that he spends time as like a vagabond, as a thief in the city of HASTARL, as a priest, put it that way. If you haven't read the book, I'm not going to spoil it, and as a mage. And that at the time was to get him to the big Forgotten Realms D&D character to have experience basically all the main classes for Dungeons & Dragons at the time. And a good chunk of the book is his time as a thief, and there were a couple chapters that were cut. You can read these online. There's actually 4 of these, and this is the 3rd one. So I will link this down below. But again, if you haven't read the story, I probably wouldn't read it, but it's kind of got an alternate ending to some characters' storylines, story arcs that are just different from the book. And they were cut, this chapter is specifically cut because at the time, the publisher TSR had this strict policy of what was allowed and what wasn't allowed, and I guess this was considered too dark. And it is kind of, and it made me kind of emotional, but it wasn't like, you know, gross or anything like that. But Dark Times of HASTARL involves thieves, and they make a hit, they make a getaway, and the getaway doesn't quite work out like they would hope, and what you might even expect, you know, from main characters in a book. And then we have The Price by Steve Shaw. Now this is one story from the Whetstone issue 1, which I read recently, and this was my favorite, so that's why I decided to include it here. This is a story, it's basically if you had old General King Conan facing off against young thief Conan. And it's really interesting. There's a lot of dialogue going on, not a ton amount of action, but it's a fun exercise. It was fun to read through, and I would recommend it. It's free online. I'll link that one too. And then we have XUTHAL of the Dusk, which is another Robert E. Howard. It's my second one and my last on this list, which is another fun Conan story about a city in the desert that is, I don't know if you want to call it a lost city. It's kind of a hidden city in a sense. It's really odd. It's about drugs and decadence. It kind of reminds me of the Dreaming City from Michael Moorcock's Elric stuff, but it's a very, very good read. And of course, this is one of the Conan stories where Conan has his damsel with him. So, very fun story. Again, I just recommend about any Conan story though. We have The Sunken Land by Fritz Leiber. My first Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. This is basically his Atlantis story. The story starts off with Fafhrd finding this peculiar ring in the mouth of a fish. It gets even wilder from there. So I would highly recommend this one if you're just a fan of, if you want to try out Fritz Leiber's stuff. I don't know where you'd be able to read it without getting it in the book Swords Against Death, but it is a super fun one. I have along the same lines Lean Times and LANKHMAR, which can be found in Swords in the Mist. This is kind of a longer one, but it is, it's still short. And this one is funny. It is honestly probably one of the funniest Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stories. And it's about when the duo actually breaks up and they start working for different people, and they're not really doing their own thing together like they typically do. And it's just a wild ride from start to finish. It's very comical, and you just have to read it. And then for the last one, we have GUYAL of SFERE. I don't really know how to say it, honestly. It's another Jack Vance story. This is the last one in the Dying Earth. And this one, I liked it a lot for the Library of Man, if I believe what it's called, Museum of Man, something like that. It's a museum or library that contains like all this like knowledge on man, on like humankind, and it doesn't really get to that knowledge until the end. Before that, involves like a demon and like a strange adventurer, and like, yeah, it's weird. It's weird, just like Jack Vance's stuff is. But I always thought I thought it was a good adventure about someone seeking knowledge. And the last paragraph of that story, I just remember thinking like, wow, mind blown. But it was also kind of because it's like the only knowledge we really get on like the setting of the dying Earth. Since I kind of always assumed it was on Earth, but it's so far in the future, and you know, the characters aren't really knowing that much. They're not talking about that much of like the past of the world and stuff like that. So it was interesting to know, for example, like this is the story that confirms that people did leave, you know, that people left in spacecraft, you know, at some point in the past. But then you have these people that are just sitting here waiting for the sun to burn out on Earth. So super fun story, and that's gonna end my list of 12 for today. I hope this video is cohesive enough for you, and that you found something in here that maybe you would want to go read yourself now. And hopefully, if you do go read these, let me know, and hopefully you will enjoy them. I think these will hopefully someone will get something out of this video. Let me just leave it at that. So anyways, this has been Liam with Liam's Lyceum. I'll catch you next time.